Season 2 of One Punch Man is less about Saitama and more about a feeling we all know. It's about how different people respond to the frustration of not being able to get what they want, how they respond to those who are simply better than them, how they act when they struggle and strive for something and it just doesn't work out, as though there's something missing from them that just doesn't let them reach it. Do they overcome that feeling, accept it, or seek whatever possible shortcut to bypass the effort? And what are the consequences of that choice? We see a whole spectrum of these responses. Fubuki crushes rookies and clings to a rank to offset the frustration of her all-powerful older sister. Genos finally accepts his weaknesses and begins to truly evolve. And of course, the centerpiece of the season, Garou, rejects all limits and personal barriers, using everything and anything possible to climb that staircase an inch at a time if he needs to. The season immediately introduces the consequence of taking the kind of unethical shortcut, albeit unintentionally of course, with King. Season 1 left him, like many S-class heroes, as a huge mystery. How this very ordinary looking dude was so strong that even the other Class S heroes feared him. Of course, King is revealed to be a complete fraud who just coincidentally happened to be there whenever Saitama defeated a monster, claiming the credit that Saitama never received. Getting such status and approval by pure chance might sound great to a lot of us, the money alone would probably solve a huge chunk of our problems. For instance, his Class S standing allows him to just loaf around without worrying about a job. But, of course, he has to walk around constantly fearing for his life because a single monster could expose him if it ever saw through his bluffs. He feels constant shame, knowing he's not the man everyone sees him to be. The shortcut he inadvertently took, the lie he's too terrified to stop perpetuating, has given him the comfort of not needing to look for a job at the expense of his mental peace. An existence of constant paralyzing fear and a deep-seated self-loathing he numbs with entertainment. He's a stark contrast to Saitama's indifference and Garou's relentless drive. He's trapped by his lie whilst the others are moving forward. And speaking of Garou, who shows up at the end of Season 1, he's one of the very few characters that are both strong and willing to admit when they're beat. We don't see a lot of this from the kind of strong characters, right? Virtually all of them will shout to the heavens about how they could take on anyone and everyone, except maybe Saitama, of course. However, Garou is very willing to admit that he can't take on multiple Class S heroes right now, but his response is simply, I can and will get strong enough to do so. Garou is the season's contrast to the shortcut. He's the guy who sees every single step of the staircase and immediately gets to work. A common theory regarding Saitama's strength is that he removed his limiter. We see just about every other character being held back by some sort of psychological limit, as we're going to talk about quite a lot this video, but not Saitama. He just pushed himself to ridiculous levels without really giving much thought about where he'd stop. It's as though the idea that he'd reach a point where he couldn't get any stronger just never entered his head. Garou has a similar deal going on. He's aware of his limit but only ever sees it as temporary, believing his true limit to be way beyond that. And as the series goes on, he becomes more and more willing to do whatever is needed to raise it. He starts by reluctantly using Bang's techniques, then later on reads a kid's hero guide, and by the end of the season, he's even using Watchdog Man's moves. He notes how the other heroes are held back by their limitations. Spring Mustachio by his pride in his secret move that was shared in this magazine, Metal Bat by his love for his sister, and of course the 8 heroes by their inability to set aside their pride and call a Class S hero to help them. Now I'm writing this as Season 3 airs, the first episode just came out, and I know that we are going to get a lot more of Garou this season, especially by the time this video makes it to you guys. So assuming these 2 videos do well, I will make a separate Garou video covering these stuff in Season 3 and maybe even further, but obviously this video is just going to be covering Season 2. But the big question in my mind when I was reading this for the first time was, couldn't this guy technically beat Saitama? With some of the absurd martial arts he's got, Saitama obviously wins his fights in one punch, but what if Garou was able to dodge and deflect each and every punch. Was he being set up to be someone who finally takes down Saitama? Or at the very least gives him a proper fight, was he the prophecy? But more on Garou in a bit. But going back to that intro of fighting to cross a barrier that you just can't seem to, we have the Super Fight Tournament. We see Suryu, who I really struggle to pronounce, but has also achieved great power like Saitama. He wins every fight in one kick, but has no real ultimate goal. He's powerful and admired, but doesn't really have much of a direction in life. In a similar vein to Saitama, he's bored, he hasn't felt the thrill of a good fight in a while, but that was never really his goal anyway. His goal was just to get strong enough to be able to chill and take it easy. Ironically, he aimed for the very life Saitama has and hates. But I want to jump ahead to when Snek shows up, who was previously a rookie crusher protecting his rank, but over time has come to acknowledge the brutal truth, and gives us the season's core emotional theme. I'd like to believe that I'm amongst the strong, but the reality makes me sick. The battlefield of the top heroes is filled with monsters anywhere you look. Snek realizes that there are monsters and S-rank heroes he simply couldn't beat no matter what. He's accepted his limitations and is gonna struggle through as best he can. The realization that all the time he's put in might not matter makes him doubt his entire existence as a hero. And that's a pretty painful thing to have to come to terms with. That something you've worked so hard on not only doesn't really serve you anymore, but also you might not be anywhere near as good at it as you thought. We see that exact struggle in Snek. The frustration at giving everything 120% just to see others seemingly get so much more from less work. And it sucks, right? And obviously I mentioned that this season centers around frustration. And a couple characters I haven't really spoken about are Fubuki and Genos. Fubuki exemplifies envy and control. She goes out of her way to crush rookies to feel powerful, unwilling to move up to Class A as she's afraid of having to face her limit of seeing how far she'd make it in Class A. By staying in Class B, she can at least feel like it's her decision not to ascend. She can avoid that uncomfortable moment where she gets however far she makes it through Class A and then can't get any further. She's undoubtedly stronger than Snek at the bottom of Class A, but she clings to the top of Class B because of this inferiority complex caused by her sister. Now by comparison, of course, there's Genos, who hated admitting his weaknesses besides when he compares himself to Saitama. He couldn't stand the idea of accepting that anyone else was out of his reach, that someone had something that he couldn't obtain. But for him, Season 2 is where he kind of moves past this. He faces Sonic and realizes that as long as he denies these weaknesses, he's limiting himself. Of course against the cockroach, finally being willing to use the adhesive, even if it means admitting someone else is faster. The three of them form this pretty complete spectrum of responses, from Genesis' denial to Snek's acceptance, to Fubuki honestly just being way too hard on herself. And so chances are we can all relate to at least one of them. And they all become at least a little bit healthier in their mindsets, right? Snek obviously in Season 1 was trying to crush rookies to make himself feel better. He stopped doing that, he's kind of accepted how he's doing. Genos with being through, Fubuki you'll see in Season 3, but what about the two they're comparing themselves to? Saitama finally faced off against Suryu in Chapter 70. Again, I'm sorry, I just can't pronounce this name. But he talks about his disdain for the heroes, how their weaknesses mean that they'll never save the world from crisis, and how their virtues, their ideals and duty are unneeded for fun, they're the very foundation of boredom. Saitama suddenly becomes very serious. And I think this is mostly because we saw against the Deep Sea King, he has a lot of respect for the other heroes and the way they put their life on the line. Suryu is someone who clearly likes to bury his head in the sand and pretend the outside world just doesn't exist. Rationalizing what's happening so it doesn't bother him. Obviously his point about, they won't stop every monster is just really dumb, right? Okay, so if you can't save every single person's life, you just shouldn't bother at all. Obviously, it doesn't make a lot of sense. He's just trying to rationalize this to himself. But yeah, we see him thinking to himself that he'll just forget Saitama existed after losing to him so he can return to his carefree life. He's fine with living a life of ignorant bliss. Well, of course, there's only so long someone like him can do that. For the first time in his life, beside Saitama, he encounters an opponent he simply cannot beat. Although his choice not to take the monster cells does call back to something I spoke about in the previous video, about how some sacrifices simply aren't worth it. Much like the giant villain in episode 1, the cost of that immense strength just wasn't worth never being able to do anything normal ever again. But Bakuzan is willing. He acknowledged both that he was weaker and Tsuyu was younger, and as such, opted to become a monster. Tsuyu, again, just completely willing to leave Snek and Lightning Max to die as he flees, and he's forced to confront everything he was trying to bury down and hide. The idea of someone being stronger than him, the pure, sadistic evil that exists in the world, and above all, what happens when the heroes he looked down on aren't around anymore. He's forced to see what true heroism requires: self-sacrifice, dedication, and a willingness to face impossible odds for the sake of others. The heroes he dismissed as boring are the ones who put their lives on the line for fun-loving people like him. I think he's fully aware of the irony here in that they may be weaker physically than him, but they're not the ones too afraid to stand up to someone stronger than him. As he's reduced to begging the very person whose boring virtues he scorned, Saitama. As a single punch blows away Bakuzan and Goketsu, Tsuyu recognizes the value of heroism and he sees this new, meaningful path for him. One far more interesting than his life of kind of easy relaxation ever was. And really bear that in mind throughout this next part because we get two of the most raw, interesting chapters in the entire series, in my opinion, in 76 and 77. Starting with Saitama's reflection on why he became a hero, and how he's just doing his own thing, not really caring what anyone else thinks, provided he feels satisfied with himself, but he simply isn't. He feels like he's forgotten something truly important, like the reason he became a hero. How nothing makes him feel anything anymore, even the very top fighters, he gets nothing out of it. But what was the reason he became a hero? He's mentioned a few times that he just does this as a hobby, so as long as he gets a kick out of it, who cares? But when we go back to that first spark, that first fight against Crablante in chapter 2, it was really just a moment of I've had enough, combined with his childhood idealism of becoming a hero who'd take out anyone with one punch. There was no real deep reason, nothing beyond that. And now he's achieved all those things, he's escaped the job hunt, he's the one punch man. There's nothing left for him to aim for. It doesn't matter if he remembers his original reason for being a hero because it's kind of irrelevant now. Sure, he could be grateful for escaping that corporate life, but as horrid as it can sometimes be, things don't really seem any better for him right now. However, interestingly, after King shows up, he tells him, "There's not a single thing left for me to absorb or gain from anyone I fight," which is of course what Garou is doing, taking anything and everything from everyone he fights. Garou is having an absolute blast, measuring himself up against everyone he fights, seeing how far he's come, etc., and Saitama seems to miss that exact feeling. He talks about how it's comparable to being able to level up in a video game versus being the max level and having nothing to do. And funny enough, King says pretty much exactly what I said in my previous video. I haven't gotten around to rewatching season 2 back when I wrote that one. There's things to do besides leveling up. In the gaming comparison, you could collect items, do some side quests, find other players, etc. Sure, when it comes to raw physical strength, Saitama lives in a different world to everyone else. But that doesn't mean there's nothing else out there. King suggests making some friends outside of your hero activities or taking a trip somewhere, but Saitama doesn't even consider it. And what King says perfectly summarizes what I was trying to say last video. You say you're bored, but you don't even try to take action to change anything. You seek some sort of new stimulus, and yet you don't even attempt to challenge new things. In a way, you could honestly compare Saitama to a lot of us, constantly chasing that next hit through familiar, comfortable means, in spite of knowing deep down that is not gonna work, instead of daring to try something new. not giving anything that doesn't immediately completely consume us a chance, and instead sticking to what we know. And a lot of the time for me and you, that's probably just scrolling and doing nothing. And this is something I fiercely believe in, that convenience is making us bored like Saitama. We need something challenging, something stimulating. Back before I started this channel, I spent so much time in a mental state of just, I don't know what to do with myself today. Flicking through all sorts of different entertainment options and just none of them really doing anything for me. And I've spoken in one of my kaiju videos about how this channel changed my financial situation, but the biggest kind of benefit as such, there's probably a better word, but you get the point I mean, has just been not being bored, having something I'm actually excited about every day that I can do. Not having that strangely exhausting feeling of just boredom, of just not knowing what to do with myself. And I could only assume the same applies for the author, because Saitama, later on in this conversation, despite saying about 30 seconds ago that he has long forgotten the feeling of shedding bitter tears of defeat or the unbridled excitement of winning a close battle by the skin of your teeth, finds himself getting fired up by King's challenge. His little speech about how his basic human emotions are becoming duller? He's not been doing anything to change that. And the last thing I want to say on this, and I'll be quick, is it also reminds me of that feeling of just not enjoying something that you used to anymore. It sucks, it's disappointing, and makes you sad, but it happens, right? It's very rare to find something that keeps you entertained for your entire life. Hobbies and interests just come and go, and you shouldn't feel guilty about that. But I've spoken more about that in this video here, so we'll move on for now. Because meanwhile, Garou, despite facing a humiliating defeat to Watchdog Man, is having so much fun that he can hardly contain himself. At seeing how much stronger he can become, he's itching for a rematch, which sums up those last few minutes really nicely. Although he just ends up being hit by Saitama, so we'll jump ahead to his phenomenal fight against the 8 heroes. Which, if you're watching this, then like me, you've probably replayed this multiple times. And it's pretty clear that the series doesn't want to paint Garou as just an outright villain. So far, all we've really seen of him is a desire for the monster to have a chance to win. So it has him looking out for this kid to protect him from the heroes, to try and inject some ambiguity in there. Yeah, he sees the heroes and monsters as separated by popularity and nothing else, claiming that sometimes the monsters may be in the right. Obviously, as mentioned, I don't know how much of Season 3 will be out when I release this, and I don't want to go into any spoilers before I create that separate Garou video that I mentioned, so we'll leave that there for now. Obviously, the fight itself is so fun to watch. Seeing Garou get pushed right to his limit and have to slowly find a way to take them down one at a time through skill and wit. His motives aren't the best, as I'll come to in a second, but you can't watch this and not feel hyped up or inspired by his sheer tenacity. And of course, we have the comparison between him using every tiny little thing available to him, Stinger's personality, their own weapons, even using this support guy as a shield, whereas Death Gasling didn't invite an S-class hero despite knowing how strong Garou was, and how big the gap between this group and the class S heroes was. Even though it put them all at risk, he wanted to make a name for himself by exploiting Garou's weakened state, to keep all the credit for it within this group. And going back to the intro of this video, that's probably a very strange, yet actually quite common, especially nowadays, response to that kind of barrier that we just can't seem to cross. He's not looking at the class S heroes and trying to figure out how to get that strong himself, he's just getting frustrated and wanting to find a way to make the world think he's on that level, even if he's not. By comparison to this support guy who, after hearing Saitama say, if you have time to break down you're better off moving forward, he changed and improved. He even managed to trade blows with Garou briefly earlier. He's come a long way by just focusing on getting better. It's only then that his kind of over-dramaticness makes it really easy for Garou to just beat down on him. The series really doesn't give these kind of characters a break. But he did pretty well, all things considered, and Garou continues to move against increasingly stronger opponents despite becoming increasingly injured. He's just obsessed with moving up to the next level, He reaches the point where it shouldn't be possible for him to keep going through illness, etc. Like when he says, there's no way I could dodge all of this in my condition, but then proceeds to do so, because of course in the world of One Punch Man, you become whatever you obsess over. But just as his long ordeal is finished and he can finally relax, Genos shows up. He's pushed even further past what should have been his limit before this fight even started. But interestingly, what bugs him most is Genos' claim that he's just a small fry, that he's not this symbol of fear that everyone is looking at. And it all makes a bit more sense once we get a real glimpse into his childhood, where his class was split into the heroes and monsters based on popularity, and the monsters were forced to simply shut up and accept their unfair beating as part of a supposed game. Despite his attempts to change a situation or even decide it for a fair fight, sheer popularity alone was always the winner. And it's pretty clear from this alone why he's happy just using whatever was available to him later on, as we saw the 8 heroes fight. He doesn't see them fighting fair, so why should he? Authority figures wouldn't help him. In fact, they scolded him for attempting to stand up for himself, and the injustice of it all sickened him. The whole system where the popular guy gets praised for hitting the guy without approval sickened him, and a childhood of that frustration bubbling up finally exploded into adulthood with him hunting down the heroes. He just wants them to feel a punch from the losing side. And obviously this isn't great, right? Obviously in the game he was playing, the monsters and heroes were kind of decided by popularity, etc. But in the real world, really, it's the monsters are trying to kill civilians and the heroes are trying to stop them. Obviously there are issues in this hero society. You know, I mentioned earlier that there's corruption, etc. But at this point in the series at least, Garou's motivations are really just him taking out a childhood of suppressed rage on people trying to do good. You know, he even says himself that he doesn't care about justice or evil. Had he been going after specifically the corruption, then things would obviously be a little different. But that said, the scene of him smashing up the ground to protect himself before yelling at the top of his lungs is still just so hype. In spite of knowing that what he's doing really isn't justifiable, I found myself really rooting for him regardless. There's just something so cool about him that is kind of hard not to, especially when he's cornered by Bang & Blast at the very end of the season, which in his eyes obviously just confirms his childhood belief that heroes gang up and fight unfair fights, but that's for a separate Garou video if I make one. Regardless, the author is clearly trying to make a point throughout this season, and it reminds me a lot of my Blue Lock videos where we have this kind of central mindset which approaches a problem really well, in this case Garou looking at his limit, and then all these kind of what ifs or different angles at the same issue through the other characters, showcasing different approaches from different circumstances that all reflect off the central character, Garou, who, whilst fundamentally misguided, his mindset, his relentless, almost fanatical dedication to seeing every limit as a temporary barrier to be broken is deeply inspiring. Let me know what you thought below. I'll probably make a video on season 3 once it's finished, although, you know, at the time of writing, the animation is still pretty shocking, so let me know if you do actually want that or not, and I'll see you again soon.